Welcome to the Arithmetic Zone. Today we're finally going to start JavaScript. So if you remember my analogies in the beginning of the introduction to web development course, I compared HTML to the skeletal system, and then later on I compared CSS to the muscular system. While JavaScript is like the nervous system. It's essentially responsible for the functionality and the brain power of a website. Anyway, we're going to go get started by making another file in our CS folder. Now, today, we're not going to use the go live feature, and we're not really going to do anything with the website itself. I just want to get into some basic JavaScript. So we can call this anything we want. I'm going to call it introduction, and make sure the file extension ends with JS, and that specifies JavaScript. So we're now in introduction.js, and as I said, we're not gonna do anything with the website itself. So we're just gonna close out all these tabs. We're just gonna do some basic JavaScript. So I think the first thing I should teach you guys is variables. Variables, as you know, is a value that is subject to change, and they're used all the time in programming. So we want to declare a variable. We want to start it with let, and then we want the variable name. Variable name could be anything, but it cannot start with a number, cannot have spaces, or it cannot use special characters. So we're just going to call it variable. And this could equal to any value. Let's just say number 1. You don't actually need the semicolon in JavaScript. It's there to help you, like to know where the end of the line is, but you don't really need it. So I can just get rid of it and then save. But now I want to print out this variable, and we're going to print it out in something called the output. So if you want to print out something to the output, first thing you want to do is on a new line, console.log. And we're going to, inside of the console.log, we're going to write variable. Now I want to save this, and I want to run this code. If you want to run something on Visual Studio Code, you go up right here, it says run. Then you want to run without debugging. Then you want to select node.js. And then on our console right here, it outputs the number 1. So we know that works. If you want to make sure, you can change what the variable is initialized to a different value. Let's say 99. If I save and then run again, which there's a shortcut, Control and F5, you now see 99. And console.log, you don't have to use a variable. You can just put in the value itself right in there. So 23, I put in another one, save. Now let's run it again. And you see on 2 lines, 99, which is what the variable is, and 23 on the separate line. Now, numbers aren't the only thing you can print. There's 3 main data types that are in use in JavaScript. These are numbers, and unlike other coding languages, there's no differentiation between an integer and a decimal number. So I'm going to make this 99.01. It's still going to work, but JavaScript is going to treat that the same way as if it was just a regular integer. So let's make our variable now a string. A string is like an arrangement of characters, and they're denoted with quotation marks. So right now I just turned the 99.01 into a string, and I can still run it and it's still going to print out the same thing. But let's write out like actual letters in the string. So hello. If I save, let's see what's going to happen. Alright, prints out hello. Now, this has to be a string. You can't just write hello without the quotes. You're going to get an error if you try to do this. As you can see, hello is not defined. And the reason why is because if you don't put in these letters in quotes, JavaScript is going to think this refers to a variable. But we never actually refer to this variable. Now, I could actually do that right now. I could write let hello. I don't even need to initialize it to anything. Let's just see what happens. It's going to print out undefined. Unlike other coding languages, if you try to print out something that doesn't have a value, so you see how hello, I never initialized it to any value, it's still going to run. It's just going to say undefined. That just lets you know that, hey, you never put in anything in this variable. So I'm gonna get rid of this and set this back into the quotes and then save that. So that's the basics of strings and numbers. There's also booleans. Booleans can only be two things. It could only be true or it could only be false. And like strings and numbers, you can still print this out. It's going to print out false. We're going to get into booleans later. We're not going to focus on those yet. So we're just going to focus on strings and numbers today. Now, next thing I want to show you are operations. So you guys know operations, right? Adding, subtracting, multiplying, all of that. You can actually do that in JavaScript. So we're going to get rid of all this. Let's say let num1 equal 2 and let num2 equal to 3. I can actually initialize the sum of these two variables into another variable like this. Sum equals num1 plus num2. And then if I enter console.log the sum, it should print out the addition between num1 and num2, which if I'm correct should be 5. There you go, it's 5. And you don't even have to use a variable. You can just put it directly in console.log like this. Run without debugging, prints out 5. Obviously adding isn't the only thing we can do. We can subtract with minus. That should print out -1. We can multiply, in which you use the asterisk symbol. 2 times 3 is 6. You can even exponentiate by using double asterisks. 2 to the third power should be 8. There you go. You can also divide. Use the slash symbol. Run without debugging. We get an irrational number. It eventually terminates to this part right here, but 0.6 repeating is essentially what it's trying to say. You can even do remainder. Remainder, you use %. So if you try to divide 2 and 3, what's the remainder? Well, it's just going to be 2 because 2 is smaller than 3, the divisor. Now you can also kind of do this with strings, but not really. You can only use the addition sign with strings. So I'm going to actually rename this so it just makes more sense. str1 and str2, just so you don't get confused. str1, str2, and we're going to put in strings. So let's put hello and then world, the classic. Save. You can actually add strings together in which the result is a concatenated string where it just combines the two. So hello world. But I want to add a space in between the hello and world. So I can either put in the space right here or here. Just make sure it's on only one of them. Run without debugging. Hello world. Properly laid out. So I explained the basics of operators with strings and operators with numbers. You could combine them. In that case, I would have str1 and then num1. And then let's say the number 3. You could actually combine these two. Again, if you want a space, you could put a space right here and then run without debugging. But there's actually a better way if you automatically want a space in between these two values. Instead of using a plus inside console.log, you can use a comma. And the comma automatically puts in a space between these two values. Now, remember, the comma does not change. The comma doesn't do any addition. So if I have two numbers, it's just going to print out the two numbers separately like that. It's not going to actually add them. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, set it back to that. It's not like you can only add in two values. You can add in more. Let num2 equal 5. And then I want to add num1 and num2 like this. Let's see the result. Hello 8, because it's going to add these two numbers. So 3 plus 5 is 8, and it's going to combine the hello with the comma. So some final things to note. Variable names in JavaScript are case sensitive. You see how these are all lowercase? Let's say I try to make this capitalized. If I save that, you can see this dotted line underneath. That's Visual Studio Code telling me that this is probably a mistake, but let's just see what happens. I'm gonna get an error because we never define what capital str1 is, because JavaScript's gonna treat these two as different values. So I can actually go ahead and make let str1, let's just say by, and now it should work. Yes, it's now gonna work. It's gonna treat these two as different variables because they're capitalized differently. So make sure all your variables, make sure you keep track of the capitalization. Another thing to keep track of is order of operations. So we're gonna make another number, let num3 equal 2. Now, if I try to do something like this, you got to keep in mind the order of operations. Multiplication has higher priority over addition. So it's going to multiply num2 and num3 before num1. So it's going to do 5 times 2 first, which is 10. Then it's going to add 3 to get 13. Let's just see that result, and there you go, 13. Another thing to note is that these are variables. We can change the values even after we initialize them. So you see how I set num1 to 3? Let's say I want to increase it by 1. What I can do is set num1 equal to itself, like that, and then add 1. And let me just get rid of all this. Save and run without debugging. It's going to print out 4 because we set it to 3, then we set it to itself plus 1, so now it's 4. But I can write a shorthand version of this by just doing plus equals 1, just like that. This tells it to add itself to 1. So still going to print out 4. But we can make this even shorter. We can just write plus plus, which, well, that's just a shorthand way of telling this variable to increase itself by 1. Now, obviously, if we want to increase it by 2, we can't use plus plus. You have to use this way of doing plus equals. So this should set it to 5. And plus equals isn't the only thing we can do. You can tell it to subtract 2 from it, like that, minus equals. Now it's 1. We can do times equals to tell it to double itself. Should be 6. Divide equals, so 3 divided by 2 is going to be 1.5, and so on and so forth. Finally, I want to go over constant variables. So as you can see, we just changed the values of these variables. But what if we don't want to do that? What you can do is declare a constant variable. So you use const and then the name. Good example is pi. Let's just say 3.14. It's an irrational number, but in some programs you're going to constantly refer to pi, but you don't want to accidentally change the value of pi. Pi is always going to be this value. I can print out pi after initializing it, and it's going to work. But what you cannot do with pi is change the value. So if I try to add 1 to pi like that, if I try to run, I'm going to get an error. You're not allowed to change the value of the constant variable. Why would you want to do this? Again, you don't want to accidentally change values that should be kept constant. So declaring them constant like this is a good way to prevent these sort of changes. Anyway, that's going to do it for this lesson. I just wanted to go over just a basic rundown of JavaScript. This is going to be a big concept for web development, and it's most likely going to be multiple parts. So I'll see you until then.